Today's daf is Kav Zayin and Yoma. We're going to start at the new Mishnah, Kav Vav Amud Bet. Ayil Karev Be'achadasar. So these Mishnayot are dealing with how many Kohanim does it. It's like the old joke of how many Jews does it take to screw in a light bulb. How many Kohanim does it take to offer a korban? So we already talked about a keves. Now we get to Ayil, ram. So it takes 11 kohanim. Habasar v'hamisha takes 5 to put up the various parts of the meat. V'akravayim, the innards, v'asoled v'yayin b'shnayim shnayim. Each one of these things takes 2 kohanim. The innards of the ram, the flour, and the wine. Each one takes 2. 2 times 2 times 3 is 6. So that means 6 more. So that's 11. Par karev be'esrim ve'arba'ah. The bowl has 24 kohanim. Harosh ve'aregel, harosh be'achad ve'aregel b'shnayim. So when it comes to the head and the rear right leg of the animal, the head is carried by 1 kohen and the rear right leg is carried by 2 kohanim. Ha'oketz ve'aregel, the tail and the left rear leg is carried by, again, so Ogets Vishnayim, the tail part is 2 people. Varegel Vishnayim, and the left rear leg is another 2 people. Hechazeh Vagera, the breast fat and the neck with the inner organs connected to it, internal organs connected to it. Hechazeh Biachad, so the breast is 1. V'Hagera Bishlosha, it takes 3 kohanim to carry the neck with the internal organs attached to it for the par. Shetei yadayim, the 2 forelegs b'shnayim, they take 2. Ushtei defanot b'shnayim, and the 2 sides of the bull take 2 kohanim. And again, hakaravaim v'asod v'yayin b'shlosha shlosha. The innards of the bull take 3. The flour of the bull takes 3, and the wine of the bull takes 3. So that means altogether 24. Okay, that's a lot of people just to offer 1 bowl. When is this stated? Korbanot tzibur. This is only with regard to the public korbanot. In other words, the communal korbanot, they would make a lottery and they would assign to each kohen the part that he was going to do of these many different components. But when it comes to a personal korban, a private korban, 1 kohen can do the entire thing. There isn't a lottery for if Matthias brings his korban and he says, "Listen, I want my friend Joe Cohen to do this korban." Okay, Joe Cohen's going to do it, and he does the whole thing.
But when it comes to an animal like a bull or an oxen,
right,
there's no way that 1 person can do that.
A bull, no, well, they could do it piece by piece. Each one of these pieces, a butcher could pick up. I mean, you could pick it up. It's just one at a time. One at a time.
Completely exhausted.
Right, it would be tiring. It'd be tiring, yeah. And then it says, Hefshetan v'nituchan, the skinning and the cutting up of these various korbanot, because they would have to skin them and they would cut them into pieces before they would offer the parts that go on the altar. Shel elu va'elu shavin, of both of them are shavin, equal. So we're going to see what that means immediately. The Gemara says, Tana hefshetan v'nituchan shavin bizar. What it means when it says that they're equal is that they can be done by a non-kohen. In other words, they have to a kohen will throw the blood of the korban on the altar and so on, and then they can give it to a non-kohen to cut up and skin the animal, and then they take the parts and they offer them. The kohanim have to do the offering, but they don't have to do the skinning and the butchering of the animals. Amar Chizkiah said, how do we know that the hefshet and nituach, that the skinning and the butchering up of these animals can be done by a non-kohen? Shenemar v'natnu b'nei Aaron kohen esh al hamizbeach. Because it says that the Bnei Aharon Kohen, the sons of Aharon the Kohen, will put fire on the altar. Netinat esh baya kehona. And that means that putting fire on the altar requires kehona, it requires kohanim, but But the skinning and the slicing up of the animal did not require a kohen. In other words, because after the throwing of the blood it mentions the putting of the fire, it's referring to things after the slaughtering, and it mentions specifically that the Bnei Aharon have to put fire on the mizbeach, but it doesn't say that they have to do any of the other preliminaries, so they don't have to to skin and to butcher the korbanot. Now we go to Kav Zayin Amud Aleph. Isn't this pasuk about the kohanim putting fire on the mizbeach necessary in its own right? How can you use it to tell us that the skinning and the butchering can be done by a non-kohen? Isn't it necessary to emphasize that kohanim put the fire on the mizbeach? It's not an exclusion of something else. It's telling you they have to do it. Okay, why is it telling you have to do it? Because you might think that all I'm doing is putting fire on the mizbeach. It's not part of the korban. That's just a preliminary. So maybe you would think a kohen didn't have to do that. Anybody could do that. So therefore it has to tell you a kohen does that. That doesn't mean to exclude kohanim from something else. In other words, you're telling me that this verse that tells me that a Kohen has to put fire on the altar is extra. I don't really need it. So why is it emphasizing that a Kohen does that? Oh, to tell you that a Kohen doesn't have to do the skinning. But no, it's not telling you something it's not telling you something else. It's necessary in its own right to tell me that the fire has to be placed by the Kohen. Okay, Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Rav Shimi bar Ashi said, Ashkachte Abaye, I found Abaye. Dehavam masbar le'lebrain. He was explaining this whole halakha to his son. V'shachat shechita bazar kshera. He mentioned that the pasuk says v'shachat. He will slaughter, which means shechita, that the bazar kshera can be done by a non-kohen. The shechita only. Even in korbanot, a non-kohen can do the slaughtering, just not the rest of the process.
This is only according to...
according to everyone.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's a general halakha. So where do you get this from? Because it says in the pasuk, you and your sons should guard your kehuna, you should guard your priesthood. You might have thought that means don't let anybody do anything. You have to do everything. But the pasuk says, he shall slaughter the ben abakar. He shall slaughter the calf, the cow, in front of Hashem, the bull. And the Bnei Aharon will take the blood. So what does it imply? That the Bnei Aharon weren't doing the slaughtering. Because it says the Bnei Aharon are going to come in and they're going to carry the blood over to the altar. They didn't have to do the slaughtering. And non-Kohen could do the slaughtering. Mikabbalah ve'elach mitzvat kehuna. What that means is that from Kabbalah and on, from receiving the blood and on, must be done with the Kohen. Not shechita. Okay? V'samach yado v'shahat. And it talks about a person bringing a personal korban and he should rest his hands on the korban and slaughter it. Limed ala shechita shekeshera bazar. Which shows you that the shechita is not talking about the Kohen when it says that he should do shechita. It's talking about the guy who brought the korban himself. The same guy who leans on his own korban when he brings it can also do the slaughtering. Because it's only from the receiving of the blood and on that the Kohanim must be involved. Michdi. Let's take a look for a second. We know that anything from receiving the blood and on is a command that relates to the Kehuna alone. So v'natenu b'nei Aharon lamali. So then why do you need the pasuk about the b'nei Aharon putting fire on the mizbeach? You said that it was necessary. But it's not necessary because we already know that anything from receiving the blood and on has to be done by Kohanim. Putting fire on the Mizbeach in order to consume the Korban is after the Shechita. It's mentioned after the Shechita.
So there's Shechita.
Kabbalah, they receive the blood. Zrika, they throw the blood. Yeah, they throw the blood and on the altar, and then they have to bring the pieces of the korban onto to be burned.
Not necessarily like a contiguous thing.
No, they're different stages. Yeah. So the point is that putting fire on the mizbeach should be obvious that it has to be done by kohanim, because the burning of those limbs of the animal is definitely done after the receiving of the blood. And you said that anything after the receiving of the blood, the kohanim have to do. So that should include putting fire on the mizbeach. So what's the? So why do we need a pasuk of v'natenu b'nei Aaron kohen? According to you, why do we have to mention that the kohanim do it? Since it's after the receiving of the blood, it should be obvious. So lema'utei hefshed v'nituach. So let's go back to what we originally said. That pasuk is telling you that yes, the kohanim must put the fire on the altar, but they don't have to skin and butcher the animal. That they don't have to do. But still, maybe I need that pasuk for something else. Maybe I need to emphasize that Kohanim put the fire on the Mizbeach. Why? Because because I might have thought maybe that putting the limbs and putting the fire on the Mizbeach doesn't require Kohanim. Why not? Because it's not me'akva kapara. It doesn't hold back the atonement process. What is the essence of the atonement process of a korban? Putting the blood on the altar. If you put the blood on the altar and then for some reason the meat got spoiled or became tameh, still the korban is done. Even though none of the limbs ever make it onto the altar, you got the kapara already. So therefore you might think that kohanim are not necessary for putting the limbs on the altar, putting the fire on the altar, because it's not essential to the kapara. So kamashmalan, the pasuk is telling you v'natenu b'nei Aaron kohen esh ala mizbeach, that the kohanim also have to do everything related to burning the limbs on the mizbeach, even though it's not essential to the kapara, to the atonement. Okay, so therefore, that pasuk is not coming to tell you that they're not required for skinning and butchering the animal. Maybe they are. Ella mehacha, we learn it from here. It says that the Bnei Aharon HaKohen will take the pieces of the animal, the head and the fat, and put them all up on the mizbeach. So Michdi, wait a second. Mi kabbalah ve'elach mitzvat kehuna. You already told me that anything after receiving the blood requires a kohen. So why do you have to tell me that they take the pieces of the animal and put it on the mizbeach? Obviously that comes after receiving the blood. So why do I need it? So obviously to tell you that yes, the Kohanim have to put the limbs on the altar, but they don't have to butcher the limbs. They don't have to skin the animal themselves. That they need not do. But maybe the reason why you need to mention that the Kohanim place the limbs on the mizbeach is to tell you that Kohanim are necessary for that, but they don't have to put the wood on the mizbeach. The Shnei Gezerei Etzim. There were two things of wood that they put on there. One was called the Ma'aracha, the actual pyre of wood, and then there were two blocks of wood that they would bring up during the Korban Tamid every day, called Shnei Gezerei Etzim, that we read about in the Abaya Hava Mesader Seder Ma'aracha Mishmad Digmar Vadi Ba'ada B'Shaul. One of the things is Shnei Gezerei Etzim. Okay, so that's these are the two logs that they would bring. Maybe Kohanim are not necessary for that because that's not part of the Korban. That's a separate thing that goes up there.
So, stranger can't do this.
That's what they're asking. Zar wouldn't be. So, well, that's what they're asking. They're saying maybe when it emphasizes that the Kohen has to put the meat of the Korban, it means he has to put the meat, but he doesn't have to put the wood. A non-Kohen could put the wood. So the Gemara says, Mistabra dibcha dikvate mema'et. No, this is not coming to tell you that the wood can be put by non-Kohen. It's coming to tell you that the butchering and the skinning can be done by a non-Kohen. Because when it's talking about meat and it says put the limb, that a Kohanim must put the limbs on the altar, the implication is we're still talking about the limbs. Right? We're excluding something about the limbs. That yes, Kohanim have to put the limbs on the altar, but they don't have to cut up the limbs. Okay? So the Gemara says no. Sidur dekevate mema'et. Maybe it's excluding. In other words, we're trying to figure out why does the Torah emphasize that Kohanim must place the limbs on the altar? Is it to tell you that they must place the limbs on the altar, but they don't have to actually cut up the limbs beforehand? Someone else can do that. Or is it to tell you that they must place the limbs on the altar, but they don't have to place the wood on the altar? Which one is it? So the Gemara says you could go either way. So lo salka datach. Don't think that it's telling you that they can put the wood, that a non-Kohen can put the wood. Because the Amar Mor, because the Master said, Ve'ekriva Kohen et hakol hamizbecha. Because it says that the Kohen will put everything on the Mizbeach. Zoho lachat evarim lakevesh. That this is referring to putting the limbs on the ramp, because they would first bring the limbs of the animal onto the ramp, and then they would move them onto the top of the mizbeach. Holachat evarim lakevesh udevaya kehuna, holachat etzim lo baya kehuna, hasidur shenegzer etzim baya kehuna. Which is to tell you like this: that bringing the limbs to the ramp requires a Kohen, as does putting the limbs on the Mizbeach itself, on the altar itself. However, when it comes to wood, placement of the wood on the Mizbeach requires a Kohen. But bringing the wood up to the ramp doesn't require a Kohen. Okay, but what does that show you? That placing the wood definitely does require a Kohen. So the Torah is not trying to tell you that placing the wood is not necessary to have a Kohen. Anything that goes on that Mizbeach has to be done by a Kohen, that's for sure. The question is which preliminaries have to be done by a Kohen. And so what they're saying is that it's coming to tell you that the butchering of the animal, the cutting up, and the skinning doesn't have to be done by a Kohen. That's what's being excluded here. So then, ve'arechu lamali. So why do I need the pasuk of ve'arechu? That they set it up, that they place the wood up there. Why do I need that? To tell you that lima'uteh hefshet v'nituach. To teach you that Kohanim are not necessary for setting up. They are necessary for setting up the limbs on the altar and the wood on the altar, but not for the butchering of the animal and the skinning. Now the next few words according to the Vilna Gaon should be taken out of the Gemara, where it says ve'ema hachinami legufei. That should be taken out, but it should say ve'ela ve'ektira kohen et hakol. When it says ve'ektir hakohen et hakol, because there are two psukim, ve'ekriva kohen et hakol and ve'ektira kohen et hakol. So lemay ata. So what is it coming to tell us when it says V'hiktira kohen et hakol, that he should burn everything? It's coming to tell you Lema'uteh hefsher v'nituach V'hikriva kohen et hakol hamizbech hazo holachat ivrim lekevesh. So now we're summarizing, okay? So V'hiktira kohen et hakol, when it says that the kohen should burn everything, that means that he doesn't have to butcher everything and he doesn't have to skin everything, but he does have to place it on the mizbeach. V'ikriva kohen et hakol hamizbeach hazo holachat ivarim lekevesh. When it says that the kohen has to bring everything close to the altar, that means bringing the limbs to the ramp. Holachat ivarim lekevesh hu debaya keuna, holachat etzim lo baya keuna, hasidur shenegzira etzim baya keuna. Which means that bringing the limbs up to the ramp requires a kohen, as does putting them on the altar. With wood, bringing the wood up to the ramp doesn't require a kohen, but putting it on the mizbeach does require a kohen. V'natenu legufei. And when it says v'natenu, that they should put that bnei Aharon HaKohanim v'natenu bnei Aharon HaKohanim esh al hamizbeach legufei. It's necessary for its own right. What did we say before? It's necessary to tell you, because you might have thought that even putting the limbs on the altar, the kohen doesn't have to do. Why not? Because it's not essential to the kapara.
Now, in one of the prior sugyot, they were raising the issue of a task being subdivided like that because it looks bad.
It looks bad, right?
That like you start.
Well, that's why there's a machloket. Does the same kohen come and finish it, or does a different kohen come?
Because it looks like why you can't finish.
That was a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That was from yesterday, right? So that's a different issue, but still, it's definitely cut into two parts. The process, right? So one could be for a non-kohen, but in the end, no, they both have to be done by a kohen when it comes to the limbs. Only the wood, there's a distinction that a non-kohen could bring the wood to the ramp. They just can't put it on.
Like a task that's subdivided into two parts. That's like.
But since it's still a preliminary of a preliminary, because it's not the same as the korban itself dealing with the korban directly, because you're bringing wood. So the wood, you could see that it's a little bit removed from the essential korban. More so than other aspects. So in any case, so we have that ligufei. We say that natenu is to teach us ligufei for its own sake. Ve'arechu, and the words ve'arechu, what does that come to tell you now? So since now we've concluded that vehiktira kohen et hakol is where we get the idea that the kohen doesn't have to do the skinning and the slaughter and the butchering. Okay, and from v'hikriva kohen, that means that the kohen has to bring the limbs to the ramp as well as put them on the. And then v'natenu is teaching you that even things that with dealing with the korban that are not essential to the kapara have to be done by kohen. So then ve'arechu, what do we do with the word ve'arechu then? Shenayim. That's to teach you that two kohanim, bnei Aharon shenayim, ha kohanim shenayim. So there are 3 words in a row that mean double to give you a total of 6. Lamadnu litaleh. This teaches you about a sheep. Sheta'un shisha, that it requires 6 people to bring it up. Okay, so that's just another remez in the pasuk to the idea of 6 people. Amar Rav Hamnuna said, Kashi Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer had a difficulty with this because V'ven Abakar Ketiv, Uven Abakar Esrim V'arba Abai. That pasuk that says Ve'arechu Bnei Aharon HaKohanim is talking about Ben Abakar. It's talking about an ox, right? A bull. It's not talking about a sheep. And an ox and a bull, we said it requires what? 24, not 6. So why is it saying 6? So he says, "V'nichala." He answered this as follows: It said that they should set it up on the wood, which is on the fire, which is on the mizbeach. Which korban does it say about it? Wood, fire, and mizbeach. As it comes to Amud Bet, this is only the keves. Why? Because only with a sheep are you required. In other words, all korbanot obviously have to have fire on the mizbeach. They have to have wood on the mizbeach. But there's only one time where they're required to bring wood, even if they didn't need it. Okay, even if they didn't need it, they had to put wood, and that is in the morning. The korban tamid shel shachar. Every day they had to bring wood, even in the afternoon. The korban shel ben ha'arbaim, the afternoon korban tamid, they also had to bring wood with the korban. So this is the only time that you have wood as a requirement, not just practically that you have to have wood so that there's fire, but even intrinsically there has to be wood. So therefore it's Have Omer Zotale Zetale. So that's a remez, it's a hint in the pasuk to the sheep. Even though the main context over there is about the bull, it's a hint to the sheep that it requires 6 people to be offered.
In all these things, they're not talking about the service of Yom Kippur, so we can assume that there's no difference between
A Kohen and a regular Kohen.
Yom Kippur changes, in other words.
No.
Right? Yom Kippur doesn't change.
This is just regular korbanot. So the point is that even though this pasuk of ve'arechu is actually talking about a bull, it's not talking about a sheep. But since it mentions esh and etzim ala mizbeach, it mentions fire and wood on the mizbeach, we see a hint also to the law of the sheep that it requires 6 kohanim. Okay? Now we come to Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Zar shesideret ha'marach ha'chayav. That if a non-Kohen went up and set up the wood of the pyre, remember there's two things. They set up the wood of the pyre, which is the main fire of the Mizbeach, and then they burnt 2 logs up on the Mizbeach, called the Shnei Gzirei Etzim. So now we're talking about the pyre, the actual fire where the Korban would be burnt. Now if a Zar, a non-Kohen, sets up that wood, Chayav, he's Chayav Mitah, he's obligated in death in the hands of heaven for, death by the hands of heaven for doing a Kohanic action, doing one of the avodot that's for the kahuna. Ketzad hu oseh. So what should he do if this happened? In other words, if a non-Kohen would go and set up this pyre, what should he do? Ketzad hu oseh. It says, Porka v'chozer b'sodra. He should take it apart, go back and fix it again. So the Gemara says, Maya hanilei. Wait a second, we're talking about a non-Kohen. It was bad the first time that he set up the pyre. Why are you telling him to dismantle it and do it again? That doesn't make any sense. Rather, what it means is Ela Porkav Zar, meaning that the non-Kohen should take apart what he did, and then the Kohen should come and redo it. In other words, it's invalid if it's done by the non-Kohen. So therefore, if the non-Kohen set up the wood, he has to take it apart now, and the Kohen will come and put it back together. Okay? The Sodra Kohen. Matkifla Rabbi Zera asked the following objection. Is there any such thing as an avodah that can be done at night, but a non-Kohen is not allowed to do it? And setting up the wood of the pyre for burning the korbanot could be done even at night. It doesn't have to be done during the day. Vilo, is that true? That there could be that services that are done at night can be done by non-Kohanim necessarily? No. You have the limbs and the fats of the korbanot that can be put on at night. Let's say you did a korban in the afternoon and the sun sets. You can still put the limbs and the fats on at night. And yet we know that the limbs and fats cannot be placed by a non-Kohen on the altar. So just because something's done at night does not mean that it can be done by a non-Kohen. Why are you assuming that it means that? So they answered, no, sof avodah di'imamahi. The placing of limbs and fats on the altar is part of the service of the day. It's just that you're doing it at night, but really you're completing the service of the day. That's why it has to be done by a Kohen. But a service that in and of itself could be done completely at night is not really considered a service. So therefore we're asking, why wouldn't a non-Kohen be able to set up the wood of the pyre on top of the Mizbeach? It could be done even at night, anytime. So it's not really part of the avodah. So v'harei trumat hadeshen tchilat. So what about trumat hadeshen? What about the fact that what about cleaning off the altar? Right, when they would take a scoop every day of the ashes of the altar and put it next to the ramp, that can only be done by a Kohen, as we learned before. And yet it's something that's done at night. It's done before sunrise. It's done before dawn. So you see that a non-Kohen can be prohibited from doing something even though that thing is done at night. So why are you objecting that we're saying that a non-Kohen is forbidden from setting up the wood for burning the korbanot? It can be done at night, so therefore, you're saying it can be done at night, so therefore a non-Kohen should be allowed to do it. But that's not true. We have Trumat Hadeshen. It can be done at night, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to do it. Gemara answers, that's the beginning of the day service. So again, it's connected to the day service. How so? The Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kidesh Yadav L'Trumat Hadeshen, as we learned in a couple of dapim ago. If the person washed his hands for Trumat Hadeshen, Lemachar Eino Tzarich L'Kadesh, Shekvar Kadesh B'Tchilat Avodah. It says that if he washed his hands, the Kohen did his Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim to do the Trumat Hadeshen, then even when the sun comes up, even when dawn breaks, he doesn't have to wash his hands again, because he already washed his hands for an Avodah. That's just showing you that that's an Avodah. It's showing you that it's considered part of the Avodah.
That it is part of the beginning of the day, like the fact that he doesn't have to wash his hand. That means that's
because it says kidesh mitchilat avodah. It says that's considered the beginning of the service of the day.
The fact that he's not going to
have to wash his hands again.
But if he did, then it would not, because
If he had to go back and wash his hands again, that would mean it was
then
something
determine
separate
the
from the
nature of
daytime.
What is part of the day and what is not.
Yeah, because
based on the action of the Kohen.
based on the washing of the Kohen. Because if that Trumat Hadeshin is a totally separate, free-floating
So it's part of it for
thing,
him, but it's not part of it for everybody else.
why not?
Because he's the one. Because he is washing.
Meaning that if he's
somebody else
gonna,
is not washing his hand, that means
they have to wash. In other words, if we said that he has to wash his hands for Trumat Hadeshin, and then later he has to wash his hands again if he's going to do the other korbanot, that would mean that the Trumat Hadeshin is a totally separate thing from the rest of the avodah. It's not part of the daily service.
So what I'm saying is that when they're talking about the beginning of the day, they're talking about the beginning of his day.
Of the service of the
His
day,
day.
of the Bet HaMikdash day. Meaning, what is the first activity in the Bet HaMikdash that's considered part of the daily schedule? The day's schedule. It's Trumat Hadeshin.
I see. So that is.
And the proof is because the Kohen who washes his hands for Trumat Hadeshin is considered to have started the service of the day, and therefore doesn't have to wash his hands again. Okay?
He's just proving that this is not happening in the middle of the night.
Take a scoop and put it next to the Mizbeach every day to start the new day. That's the first thing that they would do. Some of the ashes. And then eventually they would do Hotza'at Hadeshin, they would take it out. But they would only take it out once in a while. But every day they would take a scoop and put it next to the Mizbeach. Kind of, that's...
Again, they throw the ash.
Every morning they would take a scoop and put it to the side of the Mizbeach.
On the ash.
Yeah, on the side, on the ground.
I thought that Trumat Hadeshin, the ashes, they take it.
That's Hotza'at Hadeshin when they take it out. That's only once in a while, not every day. Not every day. It's a special thing. Yeah, when it accumulates, it's like the garbage in your house. It accumulates. You have to take it out eventually, or not. But they had to. Okay, so
Depends whether you have teenagers or not.
yeah. So that's the point. So that shows you that any case that we have here, whether it be Trumat Hadeshin or it be putting the limbs on the altar. These are daytime avodot, even though they take place at nighttime. The Trumat Hadeshin takes place before the day starts. Putting the Evarim on the Mizbeach is after the day is over, but it's the conclusion of the korbanot of the day. So that's why only a Kohen can do it. But where do we ever find something that only a Kohen can do that can be done at night and has no connection to daytime? That's the question. Like if I simply went and set up the wood on the Mizbeach, that's not part of the daily routine. That's something that's just done. It's just a practical thing that's done. It could be done at night or any time. So how do I know that a Zar can't do that? You're right. We retract. A non-Kohen is allowed to put the wood on the Mizbeach because it's purely a preliminary. It's not part of the service of the day. However, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, what he said was Zar shesider shnei gzirei etzim chayav ho'il v'avodat yomhi. That if a non-Kohen were to bring the two gizire etzim, that's different. The ma'aracha is the wood on which the korbanot are actually burned. The shnei gizire etzim are just two logs that were burned separately. Those two logs that were burned separately are brought only during the day. They're actually part of the service of the korban tamid. And since they're part of the service of the korban tamid, of course, a non-Kohen who brings them is going to be Hayav. He's doing something he's not allowed to do.
The essence of this discussion is what is an integral part of the
exactly
of the
service.
Of the service and what is not.
Exactly. So now they asked a question. Matkifla Rava asked an objection here. Ela me'ata tiba'e pais. If putting the two gezereh etzim is considered part of the service, why don't you have to do a lottery to decide who's going to do it? So ishta mitzteh hadetanya, and clearly Rava forgot what it explicitly says in a Braita. Misha zacha b'trumat hadeshin, because it says that whoever wins the lottery for Trumat Hadeshin, zacha b'sidur maracha, he also gets to set up the wood, and b'sidur shnei gizirei etzim, and he also gets to do the placing of the two logs on the mizbeach. Even though one we just said isn't an integral part, because we just said that the sidur maracha is not an integral part, right? But still, there is a way of assigning it. Okay, we assign it also to a specific kohen. So that's not a good question that Rava had. Lememra da avodat yom bayapais, avodat layla lo bayapais. This implies, Rava's whole question implies that only a service of the day, meaning something, as you said, which is an integral part of the service, it requires a lottery, but that a service that takes place at night doesn't require a lottery. V'harei evarim uftarim sof avodat imamahi. But placing the fats and limbs of the korban tamid of the afternoon, which is the completion of a daytime. V'harei baya. So it says v'harei evarim uftarim. That's the question. In other words, why then do we assign placement of the limbs and fats on the altar to a kohen by a lottery, since that can be done at night, according to Rava? Only something done during the day needs a lottery.
Well, that also they brought the fact.
So the answer is no, because it's sof avodat yemamahi. It's the end of the daytime
service. Assigned to a
service.
kohen, and the kohen assigns it to a non-kohen.
No, he can't. He can never do. It has to be a kohen. It has to be a kohen.
No. But the part that can be done
right, the placing of the wood, you mean,
the
alone.
placing of the wood, right?
Right, but we're not talking about that now. We're just saying in general, Rava's question was predicated on the assumption that if it's an avodat yom, if it's a service of the day, part of the considered an integral part of the service. So then a kohen is then a lottery is necessary, because he said, "Why is there no lottery?" We said, "Yes, there is a lottery." Okay, but if that's true that only daytime avodot require a lottery, what about putting the limbs and fats of the korban on the altar? Isn't that a nighttime thing? Answer is again, so if avodat yemamahi, it's really the conclusion of the day. V'harei trumat hadeshen. What about the trumat hadeshen? Mishum ma'aseh shehaya. You're right. We wouldn't have a lottery for the trumat hadeshen. But remember, Maaseh Shahaya, remember the situation of the racing that they used to do when terrible things happen. So they decided to make a lottery. Okay? Now it could have also answered that no, that's also considered the beginning of the service of the day. But it doesn't say that. But anyway, that's a good question why it doesn't give that answer, like it just gave above. But anyway, okay, so let's get this straight here. Anything which is a service of the daytime, meaning it's part of the integral part of the daily schedule of the Beit HaMikdash, and that a zar is not allowed to do, these are the things that require a lottery. And en zar chayav alea mita lo bayapais. But anything that a zar in theory could do won't be assigned by a lottery, according to this logic, right? But what about v'harei shechita? What about slaughtering of the korban? We know that a non-kohen is allowed to do the slaughtering. So how come we assign it by lottery then, according to this? Answer is shani shechita de tchilat avodahi. Since the shechita, even though it's true, it could be done by the kohen, but since it could be done by a non-kohen, but since it's the beginning of the process, which is typically done by kohanim, even though in theory could be done by a non-kohen, therefore it's assigned by a lottery. Amar Marzutra said, "V'itema Ravashi." Some say it was Ravashi. Ha'anan lo tenan hachi. But we did not learn this. We didn't learn it this way because we learned Amar lehem amimunet ura'u imigeh zaman shechita v'lu zaman shnei gizirei etzim lo katane. He said that we didn't learn that the shnei gizirei etzim, that putting of these two logs on the mizbeach, is considered to be part of the daily service. We learned that only the korban itself is part of the daily service. Why? Because it says in the next perek that the person in charge of running things, the administrator of the kohanim, would look. He would say, "Go up and look if the dawn is broken, and therefore we can do the slaughtering of the korban tamid." But he didn't say, "Go look if the dawn is cracked to know if we can put the shnei gzirei etzim." Why doesn't he mention the two logs? Why does he only mention shechita? So the answer is, Hach let delet la takanta katani. Hach te'id la takanta lo katani. That anything that can be fixed, he doesn't have to mention. Anything that can't be fixed, he does have to mention. In other words, what it means is like this. If they accidentally slaughtered the korban tamid before dawn broke, it's totally invalid, and there's nothing they can do. The korban is gone. If they accidentally put the logs up there and then they realize the dawn didn't break, they'll take them down and put them back. No problem. No permanent harm will be done as a result. So therefore, if they're going to have to go to the trouble of climbing up to the top of the mountain and seeing if the dawn has begun, they're only going to do that to prevent shechita from being done too early. That's what it emphasizes. But if they had put the two gezirei etzim on the mizbeach a little bit too early, so big deal. They'll go take them down and replace them on the mizbeach. But if they slaughter a korban too early and now the korban's invalid and the animal's gone, that's considered a significant loss, and they would want to prevent that from happening. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen.